Hello, Brobs. We're back with this awful book, Bukowski in the Bathtub. Recollections of Charles Bukowski by John Thomas, collected and edited by Philomene Long, 1997. Chapter 12. I'm Charles Bukowski, baby. Philomene. Besides LA's lowlife, with whom did he spend the most time? Who were some of his male friends? Neely, for example, who later became his biographer. Entitled Hank and published by Random House. John. Neely was later. Philomene. What was their relationship? John. Neely Cherkovsky was trying to be his disciple. He was just a little chunky kid who would tag along with him. Philomene. Which Hank easily welcomed? John. Oh, yeah? Philomene. Describe that scene, Hank and Neely. John. If I'm not mistaken, Neely was living in San Bernardino, and he would drive over to see Hank as much as he could. Philomene. And Hank would call him his little Rambo, but they were scarcely Verlaine and Rambo. John, I don't think he meant that. Just that Neely was a 19-year-old poet. I don't even think he was 19. I think he was 16. He would tag along with Hank, and sometimes they would go to Barney's Beanery. For some reason, they both thought Barney's was hip. Philomene. It was hip in those days. Go on, John. Hip, ha. How do you indicate on the page? A scornful silence on my part. I went over there with the two of them one time. Hank was a little drunk. Neely, of course, was not sitting at his feet, because it's hard to sit at somebody's feet when you're both on bar stools, but he would constantly flatter, fatuous compliments. Philomene. And Hank didn't mind that? John. No, Hank didn't mind that at all. In fact, that night he started saying loud enough so that people around him could hear, I'm Charles Bukowski, the great poet. Charles Bukowski, get it? And nobody there seemed to notice. Philomene. That's funny. John. And then one of the witnesses went by and he said it again. I'm Charles Bukowski, baby. Bukowski, the great poet. Philomene. And she fell to her knees. John. How did you guess? Actually, she went right on moving, Hank glaring after her. And I said, Hank, you're wasting your time. If you want to get her attention, don't tell her you're a poet. Tell her you're Philomene. A dentist? John. A producer. Or that you're big in the oil business. Philomene. And did he try it? John. No, he wasn't able to try it. Too drunk by then. Philomene. Was Neely the only fatuous little Rambo? John. Pretty much, in those days. There was a guy named Red who would drop by. Philomene. When did Gerald Lachlan emerge? John. The first time I remember running into him was at Hank's 60th birthday party. He was a professor at Cal State Long Beach, a great admirer and friend of Hank, who wrote many articles about him, and recently a book, Bukowski, a sure poet. Water Road Books. Philomene. At the time, did he have any serious male friends other than yourself? John. One was about all he could handle. Philomene. Why is that? He required obeisance. Didn't like the competition? John. Right. And he was afraid they'd want to borrow money. Philomene. Yet his talk was frequently about other male poets. John. In his talk, of course, he was always much better than they were. He mentioned Jack Hirschman a couple of times, mainly to brag about how he had bloodied Jack Hirschman's nose, which is no big thing to brag about. Philomene. What brought that on? John. Hirschman was rather ineffectual physically. Philomene. Maybe he didn't want to fight. John. I remember once Hirschman was attacked, chased and soundly bitten, and had his pants leg all ripped to shit. Philomene. By Bukowski? John. By a chihuahua in Echo Park. Philomene. What are you trying to say? Jack is egalitarian? Go on about the bloody end of Hirschman's nose. You were off on the chihuahua. John. Maybe it was Bukowski that bit him and the chihuahua that bloodied his nose. Philomene. Would you get on with the story? John. That is the story. Hank liked to tell it. He would repeat it over and over. Philomene. So tell it. John. I don't know what the occasion was, but he went to visit Ruth and Jack Hirschman. They were still living together then, and Hank was drunk. He went in and plopped himself down. Philomene. Was this at their house on quarterdeck in Marina del Rey? John. I don't know. I know Neely was with him. Hank demanded drinks, and Jack and Ruth didn't have any or didn't want to give him any. Hank got very obnoxious, and finally Jack said he had to leave, so Hank punched him in the nose and left. Philomene, I wonder what was the real story. John, I heard it from both of them. Philomene, what was Jack and Ruth's version? John, I mean, I heard it from both Hank and Neely. I guess they got their stories straight between them. Philomene and the infamous Chihuahua? John, Hirschman told me about the Chihuahua because he was coming over to visit me when he got bit. That was years later after Ruth kicked him out and he was living in Paul Evangelisti's basement in Echo Park. He had walked over the hill to visit me, Hirschman had. Every dog along the way barked at him, and this little Chihuahua got out under the fence and bit him. Dogs despised him, but you won't put that in. Philomene, it's mean-spirited. I love Jack. I love Ruth. I consider them family. Beautiful David. Beautiful Celia. John, hatred and despisal are two different things. I don't think I hate anybody. Philomene, there must be more to that story. I recall one evening at Jack and Ruth's in 1968 when Michael Moore and I had just returned from New York. Mike had been managing the Free Press bookstore in L.A. Ruth had gotten him that job via Bob Alexander. Wally Berman was there, Eileen Ireland, Harold Norse. There were the children, Tosh Berman, David, and Celia Hirschman. My daughter, Maureen. Patrick wasn't born yet. Bukowski showed up drunk, asking to come in. He got in the door for 10 or 15 minutes before Jack persuaded him to leave. Harold Norse wasn't going for it because he'd just returned from Greece or someplace like that and didn't want Hank there. John, Norse is not his real last name. I forget it. He's from one of the Baltic countries, Lithuania or Estonia or somewhere. Had one of those weird Baltic last names. He thought Norse was more dramatic. Philomene, my point is that statistically speaking, if you and I, John, had been at the Hirschmans on two separate occasions and the identical scene took place, Hank must have been at their door relentlessly. John, he might have been, but it might also have been only two times. Philomene, so let's get back to Bukowski's male friends. John, what male friends? Philomene, he spoke of Stuart Perkoff. John, he had never heard of him until I played some tape of Stuart reading his poetry. Philomene, and how did Hank respond? John, of course he didn't like it, and he sneered at Stuart for reading in public. This was before Bukowski himself read in public. Philomene, I recall telling Stuart that Bukowski was calling himself the greatest living poet, and Stuart responded, I am the greatest living poet. But Stuart had the wisdom to add that every poet thinks they are the greatest living poet while writing the poem, which you and I can verify. John, yep. Philomene, did Hank hear of Frank Rios? John, from me. Philomene, and any other poets he would speak about? John, nope, that's it. What a book. What a fucking book.